So is Europe waking up from its slumber? Are we going to see war be the primary force of strategic decision-making in Europe again? Could this be it? Can we make Europe Prussia again? That's my plan. That's my complete and total objective here in this video, and maybe my life, is to make Europe the machine that it was once more. Facetiousness aside, this is the idea that the EU now has to stand on its own 2 feet. America is no longer going to dispensate and compensate Europe for its lack of military, both in a money spent and also in arms held. So not only do America, or does America, I should say, outspend Europe by a factor of 2, they also have many more troops, weapons, arms, capabilities. So it's an embarrassing farce that Europe was able to subsist on the teat of American imperialism for this long without having any dignity of its own, let all of its infrastructure decay and deteriorate, and then ask itself why it can't defend itself. It's fairly ironic, and it wouldn't be so... No, it would be funny, I think, if it wasn't so tragic. But nevertheless, here we are. We are back to the realm of asking questions around how can we militarize Europe? And there's an easy suggestion here. It's let's make Europe Prussia. Prussia, for those of you don't know, was a militarized political entity, a state nation in the central part of Europe, what was Germany, now somewhat of Poland and Russia and Eastern Germany. And it existed for about 300 years up until the formation of the German Empire, and then was dissolved after World War II. So the identity of a Prussian was something that did form the core, you could say, coagulating or weighting factor to European power politics on the continent. Prussia existed in the center and was able to form alliances against or for or with Russia, against France, against Austria, against the UK, and even Sweden. So you had a lot of this politicking that was required. So being such a state under threat almost consistently from across every single border that it did have, it had an incentive here to be a militarized state. The famous quip being that most states have an army, but the Prussian army has a state. Now, the reason for this is because they had outspent but also out-strategized almost every other neighbor after what was effectively the 18th century, and they had some reformations around how they thought about going to war. And this was with Frederick, the king, who was previously Duke, and then he was the king. But this is how we can think about Prussia as this militarized state with a sinecure, an ambit around being offensively capable to wage almost any war. And they had an idea around strategy, force multipliers, and a lot of great statesmen like Bismarck and Frederick the Great, as noted, but also generals like Helmut von Moltke and Klaus von Clausewitz came out of Karl von Clausewitz, came out of Prussia. And so in that, we can start to understand the mindset. You had a Junker class. This was the aristocracy, basically, in Prussia, who had their sole vocation almost to be the military commanders for the Prussian state. Now, they did manage lands, and there was some agrarian policies, and they were charged with different, you could say, state or provincial needs, so things like tax collecting, things like that. But in general, it was thought that the Junker class made up what was the officer class in the army, and that the men and boys were being trained and formed and sharpened for this role. And that then what follows is the militarization of the peasant class, and that all lower class had a role to play, and it was very important that you understood why and how you served Prussia. And it was this intrinsic identity you had entwined with the idea of Prussia, that you'd die for the fatherland because this is the only goal almost in your life. And that's how we can start to think about why Prussia was so effective, is that they had an ideal around Prussia, that you could live to it and try to live up to it. And that even Frederick the Great was quoted as saying he was the first servant of the state. So they said, yeah, we're all subservient to what is Prussia. And mother or father Prussia here being just the the political force that we can think of it. Now, how this goes into the EU is manifold, and I'll walk you through how we can make Europe Prussia. Prussia was distinctly German, so obviously that the language barrier was non-existent. The identity and blood was something that was maybe there was a plurality, but as strongly German. So you did still have some other minorities that coexisted in Prussia, particularly Slavs. So the idea that you can have a diverse army, I think, is unfortunate, but not necessarily deleterious to the level of breaking the capabilities. We can still think of a functional army with multiple different language required. You could also say that the lingua franca for an army could always be English, because very basic orders can always be delivered in English to most Western European countries, at least to that level. Most German youth, French youth speak very, at least basic English, and so it shouldn't be too much of a problem, as ironic as that is. We'll start maybe with the quote then from Karl von Clausewitz. He goes in to say, and this is from von Krieger, "No one starts a war, or rather, no one in his sense ought to do so, without first being clear in his mind what he intends to achieve by the war and how he intends to conduct it." And I thought this quote was fairly, had a lot of piquancy, because in the current state with Ukraine and Russia, obviously, that there is this war that doesn't necessarily have this end. It's not necessarily a territorial irredentism style war, and it is just a clash for the sake of it. It's the Russian need to exert itself internationally in some way, which they've been doing since the USSR was dissolved and left a lot of these ethnic enclaves scattered around Eastern Europe and Northern Asia. And then in general, it's a way for the European and previously American governments to test the Russians' might. Is to say, how much can we strain this? A bit like the Mujahideen in Afghanistan in the 80s against Russia, the USSR. How much can we stress test this army's capabilities by feeding money and weapons into native populace who are fighting a war with traditional means, also asymmetric partisans and drones in particular. This is probably one of the first wholesale drone warfare that we can witness. And so it's very interesting, obviously, from a tactical and strategic level to understand what this is about. But the problem with this war, and this is why there's such a strong clash of opinions on it, is because it doesn't really have a goal. There's no outcome. It's not very easy to understand it. And to be honest, it really is just a civil war between Russians or Slavs, or however you want to identify them. There's not a real distinct difference other than the arbitrary lines on a map dictating who lives where. And so in general, I don't feel strongly either way. I find the conflict to be a bit banal. But talking about Europe here, we can go a little bit more into understanding why they would want to be ready for a war. And that's, for their reason, purely defensive. Europe has been softened and its ambitions crushed over the last century, and so its desire to actually wage offensive wars is zero, is null. No one who is a civilian almost at all has any stomach for it. You can contrast this quite strongly with literally 100 years ago, when the call for war was a very common siren that almost all great imperial powers at that time, or invading imperial powers like France and Belgium, still actually had a need and a want and a will for war. Now, the European exhausted themselves over 2 world wars, which is an unfortunate pacifistic leaning now, which means that disarmament and that the reliance on America to be the protector has effectively constructed these client states of America. Now, the ability to address this will require 3 things. It will require a shift in perspective and will. You have to want this. And that will manifest itself socially, politically. You have to spend money on it. It's not something you can just hope that is a budget line item that won't necessarily bankrupt you. Prussia at its height spent about 75% of its GDP on arms, armament, war preparedness. And so it does require, if you want to be this force, which is definitely, say, outsized in terms of its power, then you need to just spend the money. And then thirdly, it takes time. You can't have this tomorrow. I could spend all the money in the world and I can't transform a nation or a supranational force in this instance. I can't change this union into a fighting force, even if you gave me unlimited resources, because training takes time, procurement takes time, planning, logistics, everything around designing a fighting force in every aspect takes time. And you just don't have the soldiers, you don't have the will, and so there's many problems with that. This leads me a little bit into the next quote, which is the general mindset that the Prussian had, and this is, I think, epitomized by someone like Bismarck. He goes on to say, the position of Prussia in Germany will not be determined by its liberalism, but by its power. Prussia must concentrate its strength and hold it for the favourable moment, which has already come and gone several times. Since the treaties of Vienna, our frontiers have been ill-designed for a healthy body politic. Not through speeches and majority decisions will the great questions of the day be decided. That was the great mistake of 1848 and 1849. But by iron and blood. Eisen und Blut. And so with this idea that iron and blood, and we can obviously still understand these concepts, or at least the metaphor of this, in that we have something that is required of us. There has to be this sacrifice. You can't have the ability to wage the war without the sacrifice, without the tension and the suffering. But that's good. You have to understand politically that you need a populace who's willing to be able to suffer certain hardships, because the idea that war would be pleasant, or that you won't have friends, family members, even yourself, dying in a battlefield is non-existent, because you have to have what is the ability to do so, to disarm and beat the threat of someone else trying to do that to you. If they don't think you're capable of defending yourself, then what's to stop them from trying to attack you? Nothing. It's the politesse or the decorum of the day. Now, America was obviously a large dissuasion for most of those powers to try to land grab, powers being particularly the USSR through the Cold War, land grab more Europe. But in general, going forward, if there's going to be more parochial spats, then you'll necessarily see these things foment, and you'll have what are small, maybe nations within nations, something like the Kurds, for instance, arm themselves against Turkey, against Syria, and try to carve themselves out of state, because the double condition here is that once you start to turn a populace into an armed populace, into this idea that you actually are a part of a fighting force that has this single identity, you are risking that they rise up against you. So if you start to arm Germany, if you start to arm France properly, and I mean this from a total war sense, not just the small armed forces with reserves that we currently are speaking about. But if you arm a country that's been disarmed, then they start to realize their own power in that way. And then you can unleash actual identity, and identity has its clashes. Ideas are not reconcilable, and nationhood is not reconcilable. There is this need for us to grow or it's to decay, and we see decay as the weakness. And so when you have the power, then you try to crush that weakness, or you try to take advantage of it and exploit it. So that's how we can kind of understand this geopolitical dynamics here. Don't worry about this realpolitik and stuff. All this power is just related to how the projection of force can be understood, and that threat and the mutually assured destruction of nuclear weapons has now come to play in a way that's complex and confusing for a lot of countries. They don't quite understand, is just having nuclear weapons enough? Because if I don't need an army and I have nukes, then I'm not liable to be attacked by another country. But you're still liable to have a civil war, because in not understanding the power dynamics within your own country, you're not going to start to nuke your own nation. So you can probably be, if not perfidiously overthrown by some other part or form of the social fabric, then at least have to fight against yourself in that way. And so that's a worse, I would say, threat than what is a single identity like Prussia had, that the threats are all external and that we need to be strong ourselves. And so that has to be the first thing that changes in the European mindset. We have to start appreciating the fact that we are bound together by whatever notions that they think that there are. And I think you could probably have, well, you will probably have to, if there's a serious attempt at building a fighting force, remove some of these nations from the EU, because they are not considered, I would say, aligned with what the EU project would turn into if you made it into Prussia. There's just no way you can have a country like Greece, for instance, which has its own you could say, proxy war with Turkey and its own threats around that region. The polite way to say that is to say that the threats are not large enough for something like the EU to care about. The EU would transform itself into one of the great powers, something like China, like America. And so because obviously Russia is quite a small economy relative to its population size and you could say martial threat, once you start to outspend them and you have more people in general in the EU and you can weaponize this, then it makes Russia seem quite puny in comparison. So if it went for nuclear weapons, obviously the threat would be much lower from the Russian side of things. This is the opposite to, say, China, who has many millions of soldiers to call upon, but their effectiveness at fighting is obviously quite low compared to modern armies. And so China is still maybe decades away from actually having an equivalent fighting force to anyone who would, well, like America, for instance, we could say. And so the first step would be having to probably institute some requirements. And from that, we can understand that you'll have this, in Prussia, it was called the responsibility to serve in war, but a remit the government has to conscript you, draft you to have some sort of call to service that's mandatory. I'll read you the Prussian one from September in 1814. The common effort of our loyal people, without exception or distinction among them, has brought about, in the just now so happily ended war, the liberation of the Prussian fatherland. Only by such means will it be possible to sustain this freedom and the honourable status that Prussia has attained. The arrangements that yield this happy success, whose continuation the whole Prussian nation desires, shall shape the basic laws of the state's military structure and underlie all military formations. For the arming of the nation under law is the most secure guarantee of a lasting peace. The older existing laws on conscription into the army are therefore now repealed, and instead it is decreed that, number 1, every native-born man upon completion of his 20th year is obliged to defend the fatherland. To ensure that fulfillment of this general obligation, especially in peacetime, does not hinder the progress of science and industry, the following distinctions will apply regarding character and term of service. The armed forces will consist, A, of the standing army, B, of the reserves of first call, B, C, the reserves of second call, and D, the inactive reserve, Landstern. 3, the numbers of the standing army and reserves will be determined by prevailing circumstances of the state. And so it's very clear, as you can see here, the 20-year-old man is now considered a cog in the fighting machine, and that it is your duty, and you're bound to this duty by your citizenship, that you'll have to defend the fatherland, and it's a great honor to do so, I think, is also implied here. Prussians had strong military considerations, and obviously that goes on the very basic level of students and Mensur, Schlager, so like academic fencing, scars, but also into how they considered officer college and what was very robust indoctrination in how to wage wars, and then also service of war, and how it was considered the primary role was service. And Oswald Spengler calls this the Prussianism socialism, as the aspect of humans caring more about duty and about each other in that tribal way than they do about themselves. It's putting the state first, it's putting your fellow man first, and when you do this, then you can multiply the fighting forces' morale by understanding that everyone's fighting for each other in this very sincere and earnest way. And this is how you do formulate what are some superior fighting troops. And we saw this all the way through the 17th, 18th, and then up to the 19th and 20th centuries. You can consider most of the officers in the First and Second World Wars for Germany were out of Prussia or out of Prussian schools. And there was a large spat amongst the Junker classes versus Hitler and his considerations around military hierarchies and structures, because there was an entrenched view of the Prussians and the Prussian military Junker class around what's considered form and how to be the most dashing officer in the certain ways that you can see. So a lot of military heroes you'll find when you have some researcher out of Prussia, or at least originate in, say, Prussian, Brandenburg, Berlin, places like this. The more modern times, however, yield a lot of complications for us from a planning perspective. It's much easier, obviously, to just say we need more troops, they all need to have a gun, we need some cannon, and that's all the considerations there are. Maybe a navy, a light navy to protect the coast. In Prussia's instance, obviously, navy was not their strong suit, and so who needs a boat when you have 250,000 well-trained troops to defend the land anyway? Now, there's economic considerations around having a navy. You can defend ports, you can defend merchant shipping lanes, etc. But modern navies are obviously also mobile aircraft platforms, so they're much easier to deep strike into enemy territory, and these also carry warheads and these sort of things. But in general, a navy is much more developed nowadays from a military first point of view rather than a merchant military, which might be considered something in the 19th century when Prussia was at its height. The idea then that we would have something like 6 required forces. So in America, I think, because we can consider America the paragon of military force at the moment, and going forward probably for the next 50 to 100 years at least. They have an air force, obviously very, very important, having something that's capable of striking anywhere in the world and also defending any region in the world as long as you have an airport or even just a runway. This requires quite a lot of skill technically, and that goes into the technology around making aircraft. They were obviously very important in World War II, but you can see that it's just an accelerated version of the technology nowadays that's hitherto unforeseen in terms of sophistication. So the more sophisticated it gets, then you actually start to turn into the Space Force. America now has a Space Force. This is relevant because space can be considered of primary importance around, say, satellite communication technology, but you could also launch weapons from space, which cannot be necessarily inhibited by ground-based defense emplacements. So space becomes even more important when you think of war as being three-dimensional, and then going up and owning space can be considered a platform from which to launch certain things. And so America now being the predominant space both agency but also force in that way, particularly with the leanings of Elon Musk, who could, in that form, I think SpaceX is considered an arm to a degree of the American military, of the American Space Force, because in times of war, then obviously you can have total mobilization. And total mobilization is an idea that Ernst Jünger had, who was a German World War I veteran, around the idea that the civil structures exist to support what would be military structures at a time of war. And so each function of society has in some way something to do with the propagation and the support of a nation at war. And so you can mobilize everyone to a degree into something that helps the war. And in this way, then you can have what is a populace whose orientation is towards war. And with that, then you have, once again, superiority in war. And so we can think of a lot of civil and you can say businesses in that way as extensions of the government in times of need, in times of duress, special circumstances, things like this. The Space Force and Air Force are probably the most difficult, and technology required has to be very sophisticated. But this also bleeds into the Navy and, say, the Coast Guard, for instance, where you have a lot of ship technology that is required to own what Schmidt calls the unownable space. And so the ocean is not something you can necessarily defend with an emplacement. So there are, I think in his time, obviously ships were not as large and sophisticated, but there is to say that there's something about the ocean and its ownership that's more notional than it is real. You can't buy a plot of ocean in that way where you can own it from the sea at the top all the way down to the seabed. It's just not possible. So the defense of an ocean is much more regional. It's a zone-based defense scheme that you deploy with ships, but the ship and submarine warfare is obviously very difficult and requires a lot more technology than it used to. And so we go once again into this idea that a lot of money is required, and that the American, I think, Navy is the second largest air force in the world after the American Air Force. So you get also an idea that the Navy has its own capabilities which must address its need to be global. It can't just be a navy which, like the Coast Guard, goes up and down the west and east coasts and just hopes that nothing is, any threats are off there. And then the last two here, the Army and the Marine Corps. The Marine Corps obviously being ostensibly soldiers who were deployed on ships historically to stop boarding and defend the ships. Then they were deployed into what were coast and land battles near the coast. So off ships, land the ship, the Marines go in, just like normal troops. And so they're trained like, you could say, the regular army, but also trained a little bit like soldiers, so that this hybridized version of a military fighting force. Very, very useful in the 19th century, obviously, and they had their own hierarchical structure, usually subservient to the Navy, and in that way that they were considered naval services. But the Americans split them out. Obviously, the Marine Corps, I think it still is actually performs a part of the Navy, and then the Army, which is, as we all know, a very core and historical function of almost every state since the dawn of time. Once men bound together, they bound themselves into an army to defend or attack, and this is, you just get a formalized version of that with this. The American Army, I think, is the third largest air force as well, so in the world, or something like this. So you do get a fairly good understanding that America has such superiority in its capabilities that no other country even comes close to its ability to deploy actual force, fighting force. And so the Army probably requires a lot less technology, relatively speaking. You're having tanks, which are still very sophisticated, but then and helicopters, for instance. But then also there's ground troops, which require a lot of training and time-intensive work, but not necessarily maybe as much money spent on technology or hardware in particular. Don't get me wrong, there's still obviously a lot of hardware, but the cost relative to one pilot in a plane versus, say, 2,000 fighting men with rifles and gear is about the equivalent. So that's how we can think about it from a force projection to cost ratio. Troops are obviously very necessary if you intend to do land battles, both defensively, we can see in Ukraine, the trenches are required, but also to stave off and then hold territory. So stave off attacks and then hold territory that you do conquer, say, via air. If you manage to bombard and then invade, usually you need boots on the ground for that. And to be able to hold that security-wise, then you would deploy the army. And so knowing all this, knowing that we require, as a modern supranational EU Prussian state, we would require 6 armed forces, and at the moment we barely have, I would say, any. The EU, you can see here, spends basically, or maybe this is not the chart, but the EU basically spends, well, the rest of NATO, not including Britain, spends less than half of American budget. So America spends about $800 billion a year on its military, and then NATO, without America, spends about 400. So you can see that there's a vast underinvestment from countries that are considered first world and typically wealthy. Although the Eurozone has gone through a slump, its growth has been fairly paltry, and America is obviously being able to almost double in size since 2008 to 2023. The Eurozone has experienced almost no growth. This is just due to a lot of different reasons. Regulatory-wise, economics have been secondary considerations to around stability, and stability is always a byword for lazy or risk-averseness. Now, the EU is required to spend money, technically, the NATO treaty requires 2% investment minimum, and almost none of the EU countries were meeting that requirement, which is abysmal and deplorable. Nevertheless, the modern spending, I think America spends about 8% of its GDP on its armed forces, so not much from a percentage basis, but obviously the American GDP is massive. It's several $1 trillion. So it's the idea then that maybe you need either to spend more. So if it was the EU, which is half the size of, say, the American economic zone, then you'll actually need to spend double in terms of a percentage. So we're talking something in the realm of 15% on armed forces. And in doing so, you obviously have to either borrow money from the markets to spend this if you don't already have them in the budget, or you have to reallocate resources. And this is where the welfare state comes in, because technically America has been subsidizing Europeans' welfare, because if you're able to spend budget on things that aren't armed forces, then you're able to get away with spending them on other things. And typically this goes into pension plans, it goes into state-based programs, anything considered of social value. So in this way, America has been kind enough to be the both protector of and breadwinner for Europe in a lot of ways, and particularly the EU. Now, you could say this was imposed just due to the way that they treated Europe, but particularly Germany after World War II. So once you hamstring what you would consider your biggest rival and turn them into your subservient ally, then you have to deal with the consequence of that, which is a weak EU. And then you change the German mentality around war to one of complete and utter peace, liberal neoliberalism around democracy is the moral superior formulation of government, of states. And in doing so, then you have a populace which kowtows to any and all real forces in power. So there's a European smugness, particularly against the American, who's boorish and you could say offensive way of living to them. That's uncultured and uncouth. But the American understands that real power is delivered through both physical projection, force projection through weapons and armaments. So in that, I think the hubris of the EU, when it encounters the arrogance of America, shatters. And so you do get this. Whereas I think you'll find that Germany in World War II was able to stand up to America in the same way. And this is from an ideological standpoint. To say we think we can at least defend ourselves against America. Whereas the EU would capitulate to America today in a matter of days. If America decided to invade the EU, almost no European country would offer any defensive resistance. It would be pathetic. So, and this is how we can kind of see the balance of power here. Why does Europe need to be Prussia? Because of how pathetic it is. And it does have the iron and blood, right? There is this historical blood feeling to the European, particularly to those of Germanic extract, that there has been war for 1,000 years, and we got quite good at it. If you look at the map of the world and where colonial powers waged wars and conquered, is because they knew how to organize themselves into armies, navies, air forces, and then go out and do those things. And so this leads us into the question of how much will it cost. It'll cost probably, if you gave me a guess, 20% of Eurozone spending would have to go into, and this would be very seriously going into rearmament, and that's space programs. That's shipbuilding. China, Japan, Korea build almost every ship. So our capabilities of shipbuilding would be the result of Netherlands building super yachts we would have to attach missiles to. So it would require a transformation, a seismic shift in mentality around how we think of industry, and that we have to go back to what is actual industrial production. Luckily, Germany and Central Europe, to a degree, has been able to keep its industrial capabilities to a degree. But it's not to say that we are still capable of building and maintaining and all of these things to the same degree of sophisticated weaponry required in a modern army, in a modern navy, in a modern air force. There are still some large defense manufacturers, particularly in Germany, with Rheinmetall and Heckler & Koch. But you compare them to, say, Halliburton or Lockheed Martin in America, and then the general, as I said before, SpaceX and NASA, how they were able to leverage the Nazi regime's space program into their own and then build upon that into a large degree, owning space technology. And you can claim that USSR did compete quite well there in the 50s and 60s, but has obviously lagged now, being barely capable of launching much payload to orbit. China and India also have space programs, albeit fairly nascent and not necessarily matured in the way that allows them to be a space power rather than just having access to space, which is still very important. But America definitely being the hegemony there from our power base. So knowing that Europe does have the brains for it, we have Airbus as a company which builds sophisticated airplanes and space technologies. So it can be done. We have the brains, and typically the money can follow no matter what. There's always going to be someone we can borrow from to build these things, which is why bankers make so much money during wartime, and particularly around armaments, rearmaments, and then building of what are stockpiles, because you usually lend money for those reasons. And so the EU would have to get used to being in debt, or at least releasing bonds into the market to large degrees, which would require probably investment from the future enemies, such like states like China, would probably then own large slices of European debt, which would complicate matters. But in general, this would be how you would start to get a picture around the transformation. It has to be ideological, and we are getting there. I think the realization is starting to set in that America doesn't want to have to foot the bill in perpetuity for a European defense. It's just silly to do so. As an American, I would be appalled that I am being taken advantage of to such a degree. It's nice and all to have this neoliberal democracy party, but it's just not sustainable. Why would I want to spend any of my money on, and this goes aside to the US aid and all the expropriation of dollars for nonsense programs. It goes directly into why am I paying for the Finns to be safe in my country when we have many more pressing concerns at home that we have to be paying for? Why can't Finnish people pay for it? And if that means that Finnish people have a higher tax burden, that means they have to work harder, it means that then so be it. That's not my problem. And that's how geopolitically you can start to think, is that real politics is not about being nice. It's just about doing things that are very pragmatic for the survival and the thriving of your own country. Now, if that was my country gets better because Finland gets better, then that makes sense from a productivity or investment standpoint. But if it doesn't, if it stops making sense and it's just a historical legacy artifact, then the consideration has to be much more reflective and circumspect. And I think that that's what Europe's now seeing, is that Americans don't want to have to pay for all of your gratuitous spending programs. It's ridiculous that they would allow these to flourish in any case, and this should have been shut down probably in the 90s. But obviously Bill Clinton wanted to wage a war in Yugoslavia and had a good idea around keeping NATO for that purpose. But NATO's existence basically was superfluous once the USSR was dissolved. There was no need. It's like the Poland Pact. Then I can probably just have a quick quote here from the last Prussian statesman that I want to quote from, von Metternich, who said, we had three very interesting quotes here actually. The first one is, no plan of operations reaches with any certainty beyond the first encounter with the enemy's main force. This is often quoted as, no plan survives first contact with the enemy. And this is a very important one. I think Europe's understanding of war is decades old. How it would react to actually being invaded is something that it theoretically thinks it could handle, when in reality it definitely cannot. There is no coordination, there's no concerted effort around certain strategic initiatives to prevent an invasion, particularly on land, in this way. So the threat to the EU from a defensive capability standpoint is very, very large. I don't think the EU appreciates how soft and fat it's gotten. But this is particularly shown in the surveys they do around, are you committed to fighting for your nation? And many of the Western European countries have an answer that's lower than 40-30%. And it's just to say, many of the youth don't feel like as if they would fight. And you can consider there's two angles. One is, if there's a lot of immigrants, why would they bother fighting for the nation that they call home, but maybe not their fatherland? And then secondly, you have the converse of this, which is youth who see their home being wrecked by boomers and by all these policy and programs that just bring in infinity immigrants. And they go, okay, but what am I protecting? What am I fighting for now? I have to fight on behalf of people who aren't even my own blood, my own, as Bismarck said, my iron and my blood. Like, these are not considered consanguous to me in any way. They're just aliens who live next to me. So the defensive idea or the ideology around it is very brittle, and you can see that, as I said, in the surveys that are conducted. So that's why I think the importance should be of preeminence around fixing domestic policy, and particularly around national identity, and transforming it back into what was historically the crystallized and salient version of national identity, which was the hereditary function of a tribe, which is the Varangians or the Burgundians or the Prussians in that way. It's like, if you were Prussian, you knew you were a Germanic tribe, the Teutonics. And so the second quote here is, strategy is a system of expedience. It is more than a mere scholarly discipline, which is another reflection I think that the EU should take, is that it's one thing to talk about, it's another thing to experience and know. And America has actually been fighting wars. The ethics around those wars is irrespective of their experience in doing so. Now, Europe will claim that it assisted in the invasion of Afghanistan, in Iraq and the other territorial disputes. But in reality, America has coordinated and deployed far more resources and was the actual commanding force in all of those engagements. So yes, some troops from some of these countries participated, but in no way did they deploy themselves in the capabilities of their war. There was not this general coordination and attempts to be the sole party around hierarchical command. And if you know, you've played any RTS game, then there is at the ultimate end here one person making decisions around these things. It's not a committee. It's not a giant multi-lingual party sitting around a desk saying, maybe do this, maybe do that, maybe do this, because we all know that those decisions will never get made. And so that's why the armies have strict hierarchies around decision making, and that tactics flow up to grand strategies, and that the American president is the commander-in-chief for a reason. He's the sovereign in that way. He makes the ultimate decision. Who's the sovereign in the EU? It's not the President von der Leyen. She would have no ability to arbitrate the army's requirements if it was an EU supranational army. So you have to actually install an executive in this way. And when you install someone who's empowered to run the army, then you actually are actualizing a threat to your own power. So this is to say, the reason coups are possible is because a general decides to take it upon himself to remove a government. This is only possible if the general has the allegiance of the armed forces behind him to say, like, yes, we'll enforce whatever decisions you make, and they're loyal to him for that reason, and then they'll go and do it. But so you do entrust the ability of that to happen to you if you start to install someone into your commander-in-chief in that way. And so the EU would form its own internal threat. But this is also positive. Once again, having a executive decision maker, the sovereign in this instance, is necessary. You can't have an army without it. So that's also one of those considerations around that these are not, as I said before, scholarly discussions. These are real practical implications, and you have to make these decisions and do these things, otherwise nothing will happen. And the last quote here is, war is a necessary part of God's arrangement of the world. Without war, the world would deteriorate into materialism. I think this is quite poignant because it has, and you can clearly see with the European stature and its positioning around the war in the Ukraine and Russia, that its incapability of posturing itself as a serious defensive force. All it can do is just send pithily amounts of, say, weapons, but and also money. That's all it has. It has money, and so it sends money to Ukraine, probably embezzled a lot of it. The rest is spent on European and American arms anyway, and so consequently, what you do get is just this bottomless pit, really, of let's fuel this circus, this unfortunate meat grinder circus, and in doing so, you destroy a little bit of your, I would say, soul in that way. Is to say, if you value human life without proper cause, this is, I don't actually mind dying for a cause, seems very appropriate, and it's actually quite heroic. Dying for no cause is just wasteful. It's just inconsiderate, and it's not what you would think about as a liberal democratic value. But this is where we are. This is the baying for blood that the current liberal regime has against Russia. It's to say, we want more death. We want to fuel this war infinity years so that everyone dies. And you wouldn't understand this if you had a strategic goal around war. You wouldn't advocate for this, and you wouldn't propagate it. You wouldn't back it. But this is what's happening. This is the reality of the EU currently. Has no notion of strategic thinking around how war should be waged, what goals are, and then how armed forces actually should be managed. And so, rather than support, you get money, because real support is troops on the ground. It's actual armed allegiance and alliances and a force being thrust into the Donbass, into the Ukraine, the Crimea, and the European capabilities there are zero. France, Macron can pretend as if his French Foreign Legion is going to march all the way in there, but they won't, and they can't do much about it. Russia has, obviously, its masses and masses of poorly trained ex-convicts stumbling about, getting droned to death, but at the same time, there is a lot of them. So you have to be willing to be able to fight against that, which is also something that morale-wise and the weakness and the effete level of men in Western European countries is fairly minimal. And some men do elect to go and volunteer for the war in the Ukraine, so from Western society and fight in their foreign legion. But not very high levels, and not in any serious way is this considered a fighting force. If you look at historically different wars, and particularly in the Finnish Soviet clashes in the Winter War, then you have large swathes of Swedes fighting for the Finns against the Soviets, and in that case, you can see the determination of a foreign identity that's actually aligned with the goal of the war, which is to defend territory you consider valuable for someone else, for your ally. This is not seen in the Ukraine. This is why it's such a dismal affair. There's no soul to this. It's just an experience with no purpose. It is very disconcerting. And the, I guess, dyadic response here is to understand what the army and the armed forces for the European Union would be, and it would be defensive. I think, as I said before, there's no appetite for offensive capabilities here, but the misunderstanding that when you lean on having defensive capabilities is by nature of them being effective, they have to be capable of offensive, because it's one thing to say, yes, we can defend ourselves, and you can see this maybe quite pertinently with Israel, for instance. They have excellent ability to defend themselves, but they have to also have the ability to transform those capabilities into offensive ones, because when the need arises and the opportunity is there, you need to seize these exigent occasions, because when you're thinking about war totally, it's that you either kill or be killed, and if you're not willing to go the step further and try to kill your enemy, then they'll see that as weakness and try to kill you. So you do need to have the offensive capabilities. So the EU would have to consider this as the default position, that we will be willing to defend our country to the death, but also kill you in your country if you wanted to invade us. We would be willing to push you back out and then follow you into yours. And so without that commitment, then it's fairly easy why you would see a war is always the default losing position. At best, you're going to get a stalemate, right? Like the Ukraine, because there's no either capabilities to push them back to where you started. But even if you did, then you stopped anyway. And so what have they lost? The country has lost nothing. It may be the men and the money required to experiment, but you can see how strategically it's very impotent. The idea then the investment would flow into either motility, fixed emplacements, how that actually would go about being in a constellation of which and where, because the EU is such a fragmented and fractured space, then you have a lot of different parties pulling you in different directions around what's considered necessary versus nice to have versus critical. And so like, would Latvia be able to claim the same amount of critical defensive emplacements as something like Czech Republic, which is much more central and key to a lot of German industrial zones? Ultimately, the purse strings and the person who's footing the bill for these things, which is usually Germany, France, the large economies, Italy, would actually have more say here. And they would say, look, sorry, too bad, so sad, Latvia. Your priorities, your needs come below ours. You contribute the least amount to the army, you have fewer soldiers, and your territory is not as important. And this is where I said before, you'd start to see a dropping out of these countries from the EU and probably declaring themselves to be client states for America for all intents and purposes, if not actual legal suzerainties, because you would see that there's a necessity around resource constriction. You can't have everything here. You need to pick and choose, and you can only pick and choose that which is the most valuable logically. You could obviously do very dumb things, but then that would be fairly par for the course for the EU, to be honest. But the considerations have to be around land as it's drawn on a map. How do you defend it, and how do you defend it best, and what resources do you send where? Then the sea, how do you rely on a navy which is about 20 years too old and has 80% of its fleet missing 80% of its fleet? How do you rely on planes which are basically old American versions of the newest up-to-date ones, and or if they are the newest ones, there's too few of them. So there needs to be this expansion in every single realm you can think of. And this is what it goes into, is what force multipliers does the EU have? It's people. People have been the best warriors by far, without seeming grandiose here. They're peerless, because Europeans and this is including Americans now because they're Europeans by extract, have been able to conquer entire territories in the globe in what was warfare 2 centuries ago. Modern warfare would be even easier. Now you say, okay, yeah, but what about Vietnam? America had the capability to glass Vietnam in like 2 days. They didn't do it for obvious reasons, and strategically they didn't want to just glass Vietnam. But if you're talking about like total war in this instance, it's an existential war of life or death, that they could easily have wiped out Vietnam. The nature of the warfare in Vietnam led to what was asymmetrical guerrilla warfare, which is very, very hard to wage, particularly partisans, against an occupying force. And it also comes down to morale and sentiment and these other things, but I'll get into that after. So this is it. This is the purpose. The politics only exists in an international sphere to engender what is offensive and defensive capabilities from a war. This is, as Carl von Clausewitz says, politics is the extension of war into this space. And this is where we get this matrix. So I built this matrix to show you a little bit of how the cross-correlating factors of money, policy, legal, strategy, and doctrine, innovation, and training go into having soldiers, technology, logistics, and intel support. Because this 25 multifactorial diagram or matrix here will show you how the EU has to improve every single one of these. The EU is literally not leading and or even, I would say, adequately serviceable in any of these spaces, in any of these squares. So taking this first vector, we can look at money and soldiers. Money and soldiers is fairly easy. Most of them require salaries, they require benefits, and they also require things like morale. So having a soldier who's very, very poor fighting for no money is a very weak soldier unless they're absolutely bananas about an ideology. You can see this with, say, suicide vest bombers, not paid that much, no benefits, but high morale. And so there are ways to do it, but I think typically we pay our soldiers, and so you do need to have sufficient salary. It doesn't need to be enormous, but we will need to spend more and provide better benefits, treat soldiers better domestically in that way. There's a lot of shame nowadays that goes into being a soldier in a country like Germany, because obviously historically that's been the way that they wanted them to be treated, to be shunned. So you need to transform the psychological realm there, but also how that goes into having people who want to fight for this supranational EU versus maybe their own nation. Money goes into technology through investment and R&D. Huge amounts of money required here. If you combined the American private and public infrastructure around technology and investment R&D in the military space, then you would find it in the trillions. Europe has got a long way to go here. This is probably one of the largest requirements for a capable fighting force that money can buy you, is that it goes into technology. Soldiers will always have a higher force multiplier when they have better technology. You have things like night vision, you have armor piercing, everything, drones now need to be certain ways. So this all requires our investment. It all requires very, very smart people to be paid to research and to prove these things through prototypes and bring them to market. Logistics is a very important one. Obviously, anyone who's dealt with or seen historically wars were fought mostly around logistic lines, and that the actual battles were just 5-hour, 6-hour engagements, and then prolonged, protracted marches elsewhere to more important places. And as long as you had logistical lines, then you had good soldier morale because they were fed and watered and less sickness, dysentery, things like this. Money is just required. You need to start stockpiling, improve your drayage capabilities. Things like this is the bare minimum. I would say in that the EU is fairly underfunded in a lot of these ways. It probably has poor stockpiling of both military bullets, guns. I think Germany ran out of bullets, couldn't even do army testing because they didn't have any, so they pretend to pew pew. This is very embarrassing. And this also goes into other things like food and prepackaged items around, say, bandages and medical equipment. The drayage capabilities is more important in Europe to be, say, train-based, but there's also some argument to be had around shipping quarters and lanes and things like this, particularly up rivers. Then intel and support, and this is one of the newer developments in war. You've always had political officers, in the last 300 years you've had political officers, which helped a lot in intelligence and support of an army, knowing troops, which belligerents and how strategically how much stockpiles they had and what we could consider the threat level, the warnings. And there's also subterfuge and other operations that spies take on. But in general, this is seen as much more vital practice now, particularly after the Second World War and throughout the last century. And this is not just James Bond, but you have, particularly in the cyberspace, a lot of men autistically clicking away, making sure that the realm of information is defended just as well as the land, sea, and air. And this requires money. Once again, if you think of something like Palantir or any other American private contracting companies, then obviously that's a direct way to see how money is affecting national defense. The CIA, though, and obviously other international forces like MI6 require lots of money to be able to be effective. Where that's all spent, how it's all spent is up to you. Up to the EU, I should say. Policy and legal. This is a basic requirement. Carl Schmitt talks a lot about the legal requirements for both governance, but also around war. So what's the casus belli and how exactly a war can be just in that way? How can we justify war? But then it goes into how you consider, and this goes into before my Prussian topic around what they had as their responsibility to serve. So you will now start to see, or need to see, I should say, drafts being legalized, bills put forward, and constitutions being amended to allow for the draft of men and women into the armed forces, compulsory service being upped and extended, so making more people and making them stay for longer, having certain protections around being a soldier. So particularly this comes into crimes committed both internationally on base and also in war field, in war-torn zones. And so whether things are war crimes or not, it starts to be a legal question. And then there'll have to be other policies around conscription. And conscription is one of those things that worries many people because there's not that many fit people. So asking a handful, say if you had to take 15 out of every 100 men aged between 18 and 35, you'll find many of them to be subpar when it comes to physical fitness and capability personally. So that would have to be amended. And I think this can go into maybe how you would start to reform policy-wise the idea of warfare as a natural human instinct, and that in schools and all these things you have war preparedness. This goes into the idea, once again, of that total mobilization I said by Ernst Jünger. Then the idea of technology, and that's the large-scale policy version of total war preparedness. Every business should know that it's capable of being subsumed into the government at some stage if war breaks out, because they will need the resources that business utilizes. This is mostly industrial companies, but it can be also other things, particularly around technology. Then there's also regulatory minimization. If you are lenient with regulatory requirements around anything industrial, military-wise, technology, then you probably have an edge in terms of development. You can see this in America at the cutting edge of all of these innovative developments because their legal structure around, you could say, using customer data, for instance. There's GDPR in the EU, but there's obviously nothing in America. And so even small things like that start to add up over time in terms of how predatory a company can be, but also how innovative and unique they are at solving these problems using this regulatory environment to its benefit. Logistics, and this goes into, say, a policy legal space, like something like martial law. Are you committed? Are you considered to be capable of behaving in that way? We saw with COVID lockdowns that you had something very similar to command to stay at home for any reason, with the enforcement of that via certain legal mechanisms. So logistics wise, if you need certain things, then it is better if everyone stays inside and is not on the roads driving around doing things, but actually is confined to their homes. Forced conscription of the, as I said before, industrial capabilities. This is something that can be done also on the logistics space. Trucks, buses, anything that's capable of carrying materials, all these things can be seconded to a war effort. Then last here is the policy and legal around intel and support, and having some protections and or minimizing protections around what's considered ethical, and that what is considered treason, I think, becomes much more important. What is perfidy on a legal basis? Because it's one thing to spy on another country, but if you're not willing to punish that in any really material way, so you can see in America, Chinese spies are always being caught doing things, but they're never given the death penalty, which you would consider in wartime as summary execution as a default. You did in many of the wars historically, so it's very interesting that you see not in wartime that spying is actually not as facing such a severe punishment, even when they're caught being treasonous in that way. So you'll have to have much more direct policy and legal requirements around that. Strategy and doctrine, and this is a very, very important one. I think Europe is probably the world's loser, not leader in this. There's absolutely no commitment from the EU collectively, concerted effort towards being a false multiplier, having this level of standards which actually are enhanced by each other rather than just contradicting each other. So having armies which can't communicate effectively, use different weapons and don't have a similar understanding around the procedures in war, the tactics and all the allowances you have in terms of what's acceptable and what's not, means that you have a motley crew of soldiers who don't blend, don't work together, and don't understand similar tactics. So this is just a fool's army. It's dad's army. It's a pathetic notion here that you could have something so shoddily made count and considered as a coherent force. So there would need to be a complete overhaul of rank of command, what merit means, how exactly you start to structure the, as I said before, the executive down, so the commander-in-chief, all the way down to the basic foot soldier, what that means. Now, there's obviously a lot of corruption in armies necessarily, in the way that favoritism works out as opposed to merit. Is not going to be something you can dispel and disabuse, but you can still have this more structured version of what's considered right and mostly functional rather than least functional, which is the current existing extant system. Technology has requirements around how you out-tech your enemy. If you have drones which are better than other drones, if you have anti-drone technologies, you can start to see how it's important to have a doctrine around what exactly is needed from a capability perspective. It's that we must be X, we won't rule anything out. And then we have this idea of a technology, then we have to ideate it. How do we improve it? What exactly is it about that the technology allows us to pursue strategies we couldn't otherwise? And this also requires experimentation, the comfort around doing something, failing and learning, rather than having what is risk associated and attached to it. You could see this with the American programs, that they had a lot of strategy around technology development that went through risk, like testing a hydrogen bomb. It's fucking obscene to watch those videos, but at the same time, the testing is something that was almost necessary to understand the actual capabilities, as well as using it for propaganda purposes. Logistics here, this is very easy to understand that you need good strategy and doctrine around logistics. Situational preparedness depends on the type of conflict. If you have a land invasion from Russia, which they're worried about, I don't think so, but if you are, then you need to be able to defend that in that way. You need to prepare for it. You need to have the logistics which can be applied to and react to these things in ways that's very easy to understand. If you have something that has to be translated into 18 different languages and distributed amongst your populace and no one knows what's happening because there's no coordination, your logistics will break down and there'll be chaos and mayhem. And then running amok are the other team, because they all speak the same language and they know what's happening. The intel and support here, I think for strategy and doctrine, it goes into a lot of these other things, just having around counterintelligence, propaganda, making sure that there is some level of coherence and that you're not playing by the rules because you're the good guys. You want to win. That's the idea of all warfare. If you're defensive, you want to maybe be able to defend yourself. If you're offensive, you want to be able to defeat the enemy. So in that way, it is just coherent to have counterintelligence, propaganda, threat detection, preemptive strikes. What's your notions on how do I identify these things, and making sure that my intelligence and support are something that's elite in that way, that's capable. Innovation. Here, obviously, you can't do as much with soldiers, but you can still improve tactics. There's always going to be, you could say, piecemeal improvement on certain things and certain behaviors, certain ways, things we learn about how soldiers function better. And this goes into that force multiplier. Prussian soldiers had some of the best tactics. They had a sort of oblique marching where they would encircle and ensconce an enemy. There's a lot of various things you can do with tactics that you can innovate on, particularly when you test, maybe A/B test, but test them in the field. Nutrition, obviously the army with the better nutrition has better troops, just as a overall perspective, if you consider the generality of troop fitness as a troop health. Then there's obviously drugs. You can start to think about how focus drugs, meth derivatives, but also steroids, anything that you can consider performance enhancing from an athlete perspective goes straight into enhancing the effectiveness of a troop. Now, whether you have the logistics capable of generating enough of these vials of, say, testosterone or growth hormones or whatever it is, then that's one of the considerations, but it can be done. And then selectivity. I think the innovation on the soldier level can come down to IQ level, height, strength. All of these selective things can be focused much more if you know what you want out of certain people in certain roles. Technology can be innovated. This is very easy to see. AI, autonomous drones, asymmetric warfare, all of these things require innovation. They require the cross function of technology to innovate it. You can't have 1950s technology in a modern war. In many cases, it won't work. You can see this with those old Russian tanks, as they're very easy to destroy with a small drone that costs 1/50th, 100th, whatever, 1,000th of the same amount. So this idea that you have something that's innovated, particularly around technology, is very important. And this is where you probably start to see the asymmetric warfare in Europe take off, is that you can probably encounter people in Europe who have never seen a gun in their lives. So the native populace of Europe is vastly underprepared from a civil perspective to defend themselves. So you have to take that in consideration around technology. What technologies can you use to protect these people who are docile sheep? Logistics, innovating strategic weaknesses, basically, how do I minimize? You'll never remove it. It will never be perfect. There will be a least bad version of logistics that you can innovate towards. How do I make sure that most of the things I want get to most of the places I want them to go? Last is the predictive and omniscient innovation of intel and support. How do we just know more things before they happen, as they happen, communicating them, making sure that we're aware as many avenues and channels as possible. This requires innovation, and it requires all of these things through here require smart people making smart decisions with a goal that's determined by the level of the state. So you say, we want to be the first and foremost warrior nation in the world. How do we get there? Well, this is the start. You have the smart people making these decisions on these levels. Lastly, here you have training. And so training is obviously very, very important when it comes to warfare. You can't be prepared for something you don't know how it's going to happen, but there is warfare preparedness from let's make sure that everyone understands that in certain environments, there are things that we will always do in this way. It's better to make a decision than no decision, and so in that way you can start to teach people leadership, things like that. It always requires practice. There has to be this almost indoctrination level of degree of training that comes from just understanding that you are sometimes assumed to be a cog in a fighting machine. We don't require you to think, we require you to do, and actions are just based on this preparedness. How can you get someone ready to go and fight as they are needed? It also comes into tech literacy. I think you have to train soldiers nowadays to be much more tech enabled than, say, 150, 200, 300 years ago, where there was one simple function that they had was probably loading breech loading a rifle, or it's pulling a sword out of a sheath. There's very basic levels of firing a bow and arrow versus today, if I'm expected to operate a mortar or an anti-aircraft gun or something, that it does require more training, tech literacy. And technology, this is also going, maybe it's innovation to a degree where you want to make sure that universities, high schools, all of these low-level structures are actually encouraging people to be trained in what you need in a war, and that can be something like advanced robotics, AI, things like this. This starts and stems from the germination down in the inculcation of the youth. The logistics here, training, obviously at a populist level, everyone needs to know what they should be doing. If there's bomb shelters, if there's things like this, what they are required of and how they can prepare themselves for these things. At a governmental level as well, if you have considerations around what's an important person or important department, and how they're the necessary lever or the byway for something to happen, then they have to be trained in that. It can't be something where it's a surprise to them that the Department of Education is now required to blast propaganda 24/7. It's just that you should be prepared that would be an eventuality. Scalability is also very important here. So making sure that all of these things can be scaled appropriately. That comes out of training the logistics, and the logistics goes into all these other ones. Everything I have needs to be scalable. This is how I enhance, and this force multiplier effect happens, is that the scalability of something is determined by its mechanics. So something with a multiplier effect is only possible when you have the function state as much, and that's down to how we consider the functions to behave. And it's, a factorial, or it's a exponent, or it's something that's attributed to a coefficient. And lastly is intel and support. The training here is obviously very similar. It's the talent acquisition, making sure that your best talent is actually going into spies. At the moment, there's a dearth of spies across the West because they're paid like crap, they're treated like crap, and eventually they're discarded and considered not worth supporting. So there's no honor, there's no money. What's it all for? Not that many people are considered to be patriots in that way anymore. So talent acquisition is very low. You still want to be in a super Prussian state. You want to be taking the top of every class and putting them into either political intel and support, or as commanders in the officer class. So talent acquisition is definitely being discarded for, and you see in the private sector, probably just replaced with high pay. As you're paying people a lot of money to go work at AI companies, then that's where they'll go. Best practice here also is what is actually cutting edge, and how exactly can we think about maintaining a tight ship, tight lips, and then operationally, how do you function in a consistent, particularly in a time of warfare and in counter intel? How does that work? You need to train people. People will always lapse, and there's no way to have a surety around someone's notions of loyalty. Is to say that you'll have double agents, triple agents, blah, blah, blah. But how do we make sure that at least operationally we're beating the enemy at this, that we have better spies than they do on a consistent basis? So in doing that, I think if you took all of these things across this hour and so of me telling you how to make Prussia, or how to make Europe into Prussia, then you can consider the effort required, and that it's not something that can just be flicked on like they're saying it can. It can't just be Germany decides to spend 5% of their GDP now on the military. We're all fine. This is this happy place where now we can defend ourselves. This takes such a large degree, a transformation. This gigantic, tremendous amount of energy and force has to be completely shifted and pivoted away from this current sinecure to a completely new ambit. We have to have this idea that no longer is it fine to be a pacifist, and peace is something that we should have as our goal. It's that war is an eventuality that's always going to be there. It's going to hang over us, this pole. And instead of being scared by it, we embrace it to the degree that allows us to be the warriors that we were historically, and then we can be and become again Prussia.